Hello, and welcome to the Sailing and Cruising the East Coast of the United States podcast. I'm Bela Musits.
And I'm Mike Wasserman.
Today's guest on the podcast is David Gendell. He is a lifelong sailor from Annapolis, Maryland, and an author. His new book, The Last Days of the Schooner America, documents the winner of the first America's Cup sailboat race and her journey after winning the Cup. Gendell's experience and passion for sailing shine as he navigates the historical significance of the Schooner America and its enduring legacy in the world of competitive sailing. We also discussed the boat's journey after its competitive days had ended.
Great. I always like learning about history and sailing together, Bela. So this sounds really interesting. What do you think? Should we jump right in?
Sure. Let's dive right in to today's discussion with David Gendell.
Yep.
Hello, David. Pleasure to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Thanks for hosting.
Yeah, sure. So, David, you recently wrote a book. And before we dive into the book, I want to ask you a question because I found it to be a very interesting book. But here's my question. If you're at a social event and, before we started hit recording, we talked a little bit about each other and you told me you live in Annapolis. So if you're at a social event that's not in Annapolis, which is a big sailing town, but you're sort of at some other place, and you get introduced to somebody. And after that introduction, they say to you, "Very nice to meet you, David. What do you do?" How do you answer that question?
Ooh, that's a wonderful starter question. So and plenty to think about. I think for my entire life, it always comes back to sailing. So I would answer, I'm a sailor, and I've played a lot of roles and continue to. I'm a father and a husband, and I've worked corporate jobs, and I've rehabilitated homes, and done lots of things in my life. But in the end, it always comes back to sailing, and that's at the core. Since I was a kid, how I identify myself. So I would say, so I'm a sailor, and everything that comes along with that.
Excellent, excellent. Now, you recently wrote a book called The Last Days of Schooner America. Can you give us the one paragraph kind of summary of that book?
Sure. The book, The Last Days of the Schooner America, tells the story of the iconic Schooner America, but unlike many before who have been very focused on the 1851 Schooner America story, the building of this schooner in Manhattan, crossing the Atlantic for the purposes of competition, winning a famous race around the Isle of Wight at Cowes, England, and receiving a cup, which is still raced for today, the America's Cup. My story, doesn't focus on that part. That's a patch of water that's been well traveled by others. I pick up the story after America is sold by those original owners, and take it through a very colorful, checkered career. Served on both sides of the Civil War, was under private ownership, all the way up to the 1940s, where that's the real heart of the story. Is during the World War II years, America improbably found herself hauled out awaiting rehabilitation at a relatively sleepy wooden boat building facility in the Eastport section of Annapolis. And so at the same time America was waiting for this rehabilitation, that sleepy boat building facility began producing wooden warships for the United States and its World War II allies, and they were very good at it. So as America waited 90 years old for this rehabilitation, all around her, submarine chasers, wooden patrol torpedo boats, more than 100 vessels were built. So those two stories coming together improbably in World War II Eastport is the theme of the story. It's narrative nonfiction, so quite a bit of research went into it, and again, lots of focus on the 1851 America activities. It's been incredibly well covered over the years. This part of her, the next 90 years is the part that I was focused on.
Yeah. So I just want to make sure I understood what you said. So this boat, America, was the first winner, or was the winner of the first America's Cup.
That's correct. And, in fact, the cup itself is named after her. The cup is named after the vessel. So she was built and christened America in lower east side of Manhattan over the winter of 1850 into 1851 by a group of wealthy New York sportsmen, purpose built for competition. So she was a yacht from the beginning. Sailed across the Atlantic in May of 1851. The first time a yacht had crossed an ocean specifically to compete, and got to the southern coast of England. And in August, sailed a race around the Isle of Wight against the best fleet the British could muster, and scored a convincing victory. She received a silver trophy for that victory. Queen Victoria took a tour that afternoon. And they brought that trophy back to the United States. They did not bring the schooner back. The owners brought that trophy back. And a few years later, that trophy was endowed America's Cup. And that still is the cup that is raced for today. And the next one is in October in Barcelona, Spain.
Right. Well, this is great, because I'm really interested in the book you've written here, because I sail now in the Narragansett Bay. So we go to Newport, several times a year. And there's some old America's Cup boats on display there. And I always wondered, other than, sitting on display someplace, what happens to an old America's Cup racing boat? I mean, at the time, these are the pinnacle of sort of racing sailboat technology. And just like in many very competitive events, the technology develops quickly. And last year's boat is really not fast enough this year, just like last year's car is not fast enough this year. So I always wondered sort of what happens to them, how they get taken care of, and particularly one as iconic as this boat. So tell us a little bit more about the story.
Yeah, that's a great observation. And I go into that a bit in the book and talk about how these racing yachts are built for the coming season. Especially at the high end of the sport. They're built for the next round of competition. They're not built to be monuments. They're not built to be a legacy. They're built to win the next season's race. And until very recently, they were viewed as somewhat disposable. America, which is arguably the most famous yacht ever built, and has this legacy now that more than 175 years later, we're still celebrating. Even America was viewed as disposable, transitory, and into the 1930s and even a bit after the war, the boats were often just broken up. The lead in their keels was quite valuable for munitions during the Great War, and then later during World War II. A lot of the parts were repurposed, but up near Bristol, Rhode Island, there was actually a yard, and there was a second one on the coast of Connecticut, where it was essentially a scrapyard, and the old America's Cup boats were brought there and broken up. In the early days of World War II, some of the great J-class yachts, which raced for the Cup in the 20s and into the 30s, were broken up primarily for the lead in their keels. So this desire to save things and to preserve things is a relatively recent concept. Right around the time of the Second World War, Mystic Seaport was getting organized and had bought the Morgan, and that was a great blueprint for saving a historic vessel. But the ethos that we have now of a vessel that's been ridden hard and put away wet and done something extraordinary, either in the military or in competition or otherwise, the ethos of trying to preserve and save those is a relatively new one. And America was unfortunately born a little bit too early to benefit from that ethos that we have today.
So fast forward us to today. Where's the boat now, and what's sort of its status?
Yeah, great question. And that's kind of what got me going on this topic in the first place. So I have a prop here, which for those watching, I'll hold up, but it's a small hunk of very dark oak wood. about 8 inches on each side, and a hard pocked piece of oak wood. And an old salt came by my office about 20 years ago, and delivered this to me and said it was a hunk of the true cross. And I pressed a bit and I said, what's the story? And he said, this is off the Schooner America, the 1851 Schooner America. This is a piece of America. And I knew America had broken up during World War II and was scrapped. So I began probing, how is this piece of wood connected to that vessel? So, the short version is America was hauled in Eastport for rehabilitation. The yard got very caught up in building wooden warships for this war, to go fight literally in 3 oceans, the ships that they built here. And America was, eventually scrapped here. President Roosevelt was a big sponsor of this rehabilitation. After he died and after the war was over, America was broken up and literally hauled away to the city dump, the remnants. The valuables were stripped off, the lead was removed, and the wood was hauled away to the city dump. Well, as this breakup was happening, local sailors were plundering the wreckage.
Right.
They were coming in and pulling out hunks of wood, pulling out any fittings that they could still find. So, around here in Annapolis, it seems that there's bits of America all over the place. There's a mantle at a local sailing club that's built of America wood. There's trophies that are built of America wood, and a lot of folks like me have bits of it, on their desks and on their, on their cupboards. And a gentleman once said, if you took all the bits of supposed bits of America and put them together, you could build a fleet of schooners. But the reality is that if somebody in Annapolis hands you a hunk of wood and says this is off the Schooner America, chances are good it's real. Whether it's 1851 or whether it's 1941, the jury's out. But there's a lot of Schooner America scrap wood floating around here.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I always find it interesting how with many things, when they're new, they have value. And then at some point in time, the value approaches zero and they get scrapped or destroyed or thrown out. And then with some subset of those things, if you still have it, the value starts increasing, or by value, I mean the interest in it, not just necessarily the monetary value of it, but oftentimes those are tied together, and the interest starts increasing. And, I always find it a shame that when we reflect back on something like this, we go, oh, shucks, we should have maintained our perseverance on this and saved this historic vessel, because it did lots of things, not only in the racing scene, but also post that. So can you take us through some of those adventures the boat had?
Yeah, I sure can. And but just to follow up on your point there, one of the more heartbreaking documents I pulled out of the National Archives was the final order to scrap the America. So the contract with the yard that the Navy had made, and the value of the metal was contracted, was credited back to the yard in the contract. So it ended up with the pig iron and any lead that was remaining was what was of value, which is amazing. So, after America won that famous race, the cup was presented. The band played Yankee Doodle, literally, as a tribute. Queen Victoria walked her decks, and it was generally accepted that this was the fastest yacht in the world. And probably for another 10 plus years, she remained the fastest yacht in the world. But America changed hands. She was made a little less racy by her new owners. They lowered her spars. They added some ballast. They made her a little bit more cruisy, as we might say in the sailing world. And they cruised her around the Med, etc. In about 1861, she came into possession of an Irishman who was a Confederate sympathizer / adventurer. And this gentleman sailed her back to the United States for the first time in 10 years and put her in the service of the Confederate Navy, which is just an extraordinary turn of events but not uncommon. There were, fast vessels like America were used as blockade runners. So America was an excellent blockade runner. She was painted black. She was fast. She was low to the water, and she was very well handled by this crew. A schooner could, under a good crew, can be incredibly, crafty and nimble. And America ran the blockade typically at the mouth of the St. Johns River leading up to Jacksonville, Florida, but also in other spots along the southeastern coast. And she did that quite successfully. She was a bit small to carry a lot of cargo, so she wasn't loaded with guns or troops or anything like that. She was often loaded with information or key people. She made a trip back across the Atlantic with two Confederate officials who landed in the UK, and had about a year-long career serving the Confederacy. Then she came in when the Union forces were working their way up to take Jacksonville. America was trapped inside. She could not get out of the river. So as the Union forces made their way up the St. Johns River towards Jacksonville, the Confederates took America far up the St. Johns, way into interior Florida, where the water runs brown, and it's very marshy and swampy up there. And, I always see snakes and frogs and, overhanging kudzu, and they scuttled her. They drilled holes in her bottom and sank her. The idea was that they would hide her, and when the Union tide receded, they would refloat her and get going again. Well, an enterprising Connecticut Navy officer called Thomas Stevens found America, refloated her, and re-entered her in the service of the United States. So America was cleaned up, served on the blockade off Charleston, right on Rattlesnake Shoal off Charleston. Participated in action, had a gun mounted on her deck, and eventually Samuel DuPont, who was the admiral operating in the area, sent her north to the Naval Academy, which at that point was in Newport, Rhode Island. Had been moved up there for the Civil War. So, America, within 10, 15 years of her famous victory, had already served on two sides of a war. She later went into private ownership. The governor of Massachusetts, Benjamin Butler, owned her and sailed her hard and took great care of her. And by 1921, in relative disrepair, she was donated back to the Naval Academy, which is how she came back to Annapolis.
Got it. Wow, what a story! What a great story that is.
It's a adventure. Any bit of that America story could be a book. And almost unreal. How this yacht twisted and turned through a very checkered career, and then ended up, again in 1921, literally bolted to the pier at Annapolis.
Yeah. So, tell me a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about you, David. So, tell me a little bit about your background, sort of both professionally and sort of what you do, and what got you interested in writing this book.
Yeah. So I grew up in Annapolis as part of a sailing family. We owned small sailboats and raced them and cruised them. And back in the day in the 70s and 80s, where you had these racer cruisers, and my brothers and I and my parents would load up on a Friday night and sail across the bay to Rock Hall or St. Michael's or Oxford. And then on the opposite weekends, we would race the same boat. We would change into race mode and do the racing off of Annapolis. And we fell in love with it. My brothers and I. I'm the oldest of three boys, and we were real river rats growing up. So almost everything you could do on the Chesapeake Bay, we did. Crabbing, sailing, swimming. Ice skating on the bay in the winter in our tennis shoes. So not really ice skating, but going on the bay in our tennis shoes in the winter, catching soft crabs, etc. And I ended up getting my Coast Guard captain's license at age 19, and worked on boats in the summers through college, and for a couple of years after college, did a lot of sailing on race boats. So through the Caribbean, up and down the East Coast, lots of offshore racing, offshore deliveries, etc. And just stayed very, dialed into the big boat world through my 20s. Always writing, always researching, always learning, always keeping, a learner's open mind. So when we would visit a place, I would find the local museum and dial into it. I would, this was in the pre-Amazon days, but I would find the local bookshop and go straight to the local section, wherever it was, be it in Camden, Maine, or Chatham, or Newport, or Vineyard Haven, wherever it may be. And that was just sort of my approach to it. Was I love the sailing, and I love the racing, and I love the competition. I love the physicality of it, the mechanics of it. But at the same time, I was very tuned in to the history of it, the language of it, the stories around it, etc. So in my late 20s, a partner and I started a sailing magazine here in Annapolis called Spin Sheet Magazine, which is still happening. I was the editor, and she did the advertising side, and I wrote the first few issues on my kitchen table. And the magazine worked. It was a success, and it's still published now over 25 years later. I'm not involved anymore, other than as a fan. So going along, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, got married, started a family, tried to raise them in this same Chesapeake Bay oriented life. None of my kids fell in love with sailing quite the same way that I had, but that was okay. They all are good on the water and on the bay, and but never stopped the researching and the writing. So in 2019, I wrote a book about the Thomas Point Shoal Lighthouse, which is a 1875 lighthouse off of Annapolis. It's still in place. That book was published and was released during COVID, but nonetheless had a great reception. It was the first book written about that. And so once that was out in the world, I went back to this monster research project I've been working on, which is the Schooner America and the Annapolis Yacht Yard, and feeling some great tailwinds and a great burst of confidence coming out of that Lighthouse book, brought this thing across the finish line. And incredibly, I identified a publisher who I thought published the kind of books that I like to read, and represented them incredibly well. And I pitched them, and it was the first and only publisher I pitched. They read the manuscript and bought it, and that it's coming out in August 2024, the Schooner book. So that's how you take a river rat, mud between his toes, mowing lawns to buy a laser, and move him through his life and career to the author of a book about the last days of the Schooner America. Yeah.
What a great story. What a great story. So what are you working on now?
So I always have 2 or 3 things going, and as you probably know, because that's part of this podcast, you interview other authors, and that's an author's favorite question, right? Because by the time the book that you're talking about comes into the world, they've already moved on to the next. And I'm actually 2 projects down the road at this point. So incredibly, the next book, which is going to come out in 2025, same publisher, is about Army Navy football. So not about sailing. The last 2 Army Navy football games that were played at Annapolis, so 1893 and 1942. Seems odd, but they were pretty remarkable games played by some remarkable young men, and tied together. So I've written a book about that, and that'll be a 2025. And then the one I'm working on currently and obsessed with and in love with, the same way I was with the Schooner book, is about the War of 1812 on the Chesapeake Bay. The British Royal Navy essentially invaded the Chesapeake Bay and occupied the waters. And got ashore entangled with locals, a lot of destruction. But along the way, they were freeing enslaved people. The main idea was to create economic chaos by freeing enslaved people. So I found a frigate that that was up here creating a lot of chaos over the summer of 1814, and ended up on their way out, taking about 30 enslaved people from Annapolis with them out the bay. So, so with a little detour on the Army-Navy football, which was near and dear to my heart, now I'm back to narrative nonfiction on the Chesapeake Bay, and with some adventures on tall ships.
Super. That sounds wonderful. So, David, we've been chatting for about a half hour here, so I want to start wrapping this up. So, let me ask you, so title of the book again, where's the best place for people who can get it? And it's coming out, I think you said, in August.
Yeah, so the full title of the book is The Last Days of the Schooner America, a lost icon at the Annapolis Warship Factory. And, it's by Lyons Publishing, Lyons. Gary Jobson, the America's Cup Hall of Famer, wrote the foreword, which was great. Gary has always been a supporter of my writing projects, and a good friend. And so Gary wrote the foreword. Russ Kramer, an incredible maritime artist, just mind blowing. Russ Kramer with the K, did the cover art. It's an image of the 1851 America racing. So Gary and Russ being involved, just a dream come true for me. So The Last Days of the Schooner America, Lyons Publishing. You can find it at all the usual online outlets. I would always encourage folks to try to find it in your local nautical bookstore. Up and down the coast, I know they're being placed in all the great small bookstores. We have a couple here at Annapolis, and it comes out the first week of August 2024. And I'm thrilled to bring this story to life. Both of which, Schooner story and the Yacht Yard story, have never really been told in this way before.
Yeah, super. So, David, is there any question that I didn't ask you that I should have, or anything additional you'd like to share with our listeners?
I think the research that went into the book, I'm quite proud of, and it was quite extensive. And I'd like to chat about that for a sec, if that's
sure. Yeah, please.
Yeah. So, I started researching the Schooner book around 2000, early 2000s. And at that point, incredibly, there were still some folks with us on this earth who were there and saw America on the hard in the Eastport section of Annapolis. There wasn't a moment to lose, as Jack Aubrey would say. I found them and began interviewing them because, but if you were in your 20s when America was hauled here, you were in your late 80s by the time I found you. And so I interviewed several folks and got them on the record, which always great to have primary sources. There had been some amazing oral histories collected by the Annapolis Maritime Museum about activity around here. So I dug into those oral histories and then began unlocking archives, looking for primary sources. The Naval Academy Nimitz Library has an incredible archives and an incredible staff. The National Archives have two locations, and luckily here in Annapolis, the College Park location is College Park, Maryland. It's about 40 minutes away. And desk to desk, the Washington, D.C. Location is about 60 minutes away. So I was able to carve out some time to get into those archives and find some treasure troves of original information. And then, I got into my secondary sources. So was able to interview some modern day schooner captains, some modern day folks that have built schooners, some of the descendants of the principals of my story, the men who had worked on America in the early 1940s. Their children, there were still some of those folks, around, and excited to talk about it. So the research was quite extensive. There's over 300 footnotes in this thing, and over 100 sources cited back there. I knew America is such a important topic and such an iconic topic that my research had to be absolutely watertight. This was the sort of thing that folks would find any flaws in the program. So I kept it incredibly tight and oversighted my my sources to keep it tight. And in the end, as a writer of nonfiction, your hope is that you will inspire folks to go off and chase down aspects of the story that interest them. So if I've left a trail of breadcrumbs that enable readers to go learn more about the Charleston blockade, for example, or America sailing under General Benjamin Butler, for example, I've left a trail of breadcrumbs that they can go and find primary and secondary sources around that, and that's I'm incredibly proud of that.
That's a great point. In that, part of my career was in higher education and academia as a professor and a dean. And, the papers that you would publish oftentimes served as the foundation for the next generation of papers on that topic. And it sounds like you've taken sort of that approach to make sure that the value of this book is not just in readers reading it, which is immense value, but also it will live way beyond that as other people research things and can use it as a source for pointers to various different things. That's wonderful that you did that.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I don't want, these stories are just too good to get lost, right? The story of America crossing the Atlantic and winning the cup is going to be around as long as that regatta is, right? But what happened next, off in the shadows and on the margins of that story, I don't want it to get lost. And I'd love it if other researchers picked up trails and kept going.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's great. That's a great way to wrap up this podcast. David, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you. I'm a fan of the podcast, and I follow it on my Spotify, and I look forward to listening to others. And thank you for the opportunity.
So, Bela, that was really interesting. And I don't know a lot of sailing history. I don't know all that much about history. Well, a little bit. But this was all new to me. Did anything in the interview with David surprise you?
Well, I found the whole story really interesting and had some surprising twists. The first America's Cup was in 1851. I mean, that's a long time ago. And, this is a race that's still ongoing today. The America's Cup race is still an event I think is held every 4 years. So it's really endured. And I've always thought about, what happens to like state-of-the-art racing boats after they're no longer competitive? What do you do with them? Is there a secondary market for buying these things? It's like a race car. What do you do with a 2-year-old NASCAR race car or a Formula One car? It's not competitive anymore. Maybe a collector will buy it, but so I always wondered about that. So I found that sort of very interesting. And it was a great story on how, this America was repurposed, was used to help defend the country. I just found it to be really interesting. And then, the sad part is, of course, what sort of happens to it in the end. And it's interesting how these things go from when they're competitive, having great value, to then the value almost going to zero at some point in time. And then when they get old enough, it almost seems like you have to go almost to zero value. And then if you can restore it, the value will start going back up, because then scarcity comes in and history and all those other things. So I found the whole thing very interesting.
Yeah, me too. It's like, especially the intersection between sports and politics here was kind of fascinating. And then, thinking like what you said was this idea of how do we as a society preserve artifacts? How do we decide what's important? What do we do with them? And I really like your point about sometimes it needs to go to zero to give the arbitrage opportunity to, right? For somebody there's an incentive to protect and preserve something like this. So really interesting stuff. I don't know. you said the ending was sad, and it kind of was, but what did you think about the ending to the story in terms of the loss of the boat?
Well, I thought that was sad. And as you were saying that, I was thinking, for like here in the United States, for buildings, we have this historic register, which somehow, if you have an old building, you can get it on the historic register, and then it becomes kind of protected, and you can't change it, and there might actually be funds to help preserve it. So we have this system set up for old buildings, but I'm not sure we have it set up for sort of other significant things, like the sailboat that won the first America's Cup, as an example. So we really I don't think we have a mechanism for that, other than, the people getting together and saying, hey, let's start a foundation, let's raise some money, let's see if we can preserve this. And I guess that's how museums get started oftentimes. And, that's one of the things that museums do, is they preserve historical artifacts. How does stuff get sort of preserved in Germany, Mike?
It's a good question. And one of the big, I think there's not a short answer to this. And when I think about this, I kind of think through a couple of elements I think that are really noticeably different between Germany and the US. And the first big difference is that if you think about kind of the dense occupation of a relatively small landmass, at least, between Germany and the US, we have a lot of history. So my city, where I'm sitting right now in Münster, has been continuously inhabited since at least, I think, the year is 793. Okay, so we've got another 1,000 years on, upstate New York. And not far away from right here where I'm sitting, less than an hour's drive, there are Roman ruins from where the Roman Empire controlled this area. It was Julius Caesar's troops came through as the Roman Empire expanded northward. And I think that dates back to 55 BC, right? So 2,100 years ago almost. And then even before that, there was lots of kind of prehistoric or, pretty old settlements through the years. And then think about it in juxtaposition with sailing. We have a really long history of sailing and commercial shipping from the northern ports here in Germany. I'm hour and a half by car, 2 hours maybe south of the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. But up there, Germany was part of the Hanseatic League, it was called, from kind of, I think, the 12th to the 15th centuries. And this was this big international organization, essentially, of trading partners that followed a set of actually rules. And way back, 1,000 years ago, had put in place processes for settling trade disputes and agreeing on tariffs and taxes and things like that. And it was really one of the first organizations of its kind that was international. So this is really cool. So we have a lot of great museums here. And again, we tend to pay higher taxes, and there's still more, I would call it, national level or state level support for the arts and museums than there are in the US right now. But we also have a lot more stuff to put in them when you think about all that history. So there's a lot of discussion and dispute about what gets preserved and what doesn't. And I think something like this that was, 200, 150 years old, right, would tend to be smaller in the big picture in terms of what gets preserved in Germany, because we have so many centuries of historical stuff to work on. And then I think the second thing is that German history, I'm putting German in kind of quotes here, is complicated by the fact that before World War I, there really wasn't a unified German country. So on one hand, we have lots more history, but on the other hand, the United States as a country, as a nation, is much older than the nation of Germany, because there were lots of small kingdoms here and the borders were really fluid. And then kind of everything between World War II and the fall of the Berlin Wall and reunification in 1989 makes things a lot more complex in terms of viewing history and figuring out what, we have a big kind of national culture around kind of remembering what happened in World War II and making sure that that stays front and center. So it's a lot more complicated here for sure. But if you come to visit ever, I'll be happy to take you to lots of cool museums. There's a really great museum on this Hanseatic League a few hours from here in Lübeck. There's some really cool stuff in various cities like Bremerhaven and Hamburg that really celebrate our rich shipping and sailing history. And you're always welcome to come over, and I'd be happy to show you these.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's really interesting. The different cultures and how cultures sort of treat the arts and the preservation of history. And I think that those things ebb and flow, sort of like the tide does. Tie it back to sailing here. Uh, but I think it's an important aspect of sort of our history as people, not necessarily a nation or anything, but just as people and the things that have accomplished. And how do you decide to preserve this thing and not that thing? And I know in this country, oftentimes it comes down to one or two individuals who decide to undertake that as a project, and like I said, raise capital for it, and then becomes preserved. Which reminds me, as we're talking here, I went to see the Hershoff Museum last summer. We had a rainy day. We had some guests, and the Hershoff Museum is in Bristol, Rhode Island, real close to where we keep the boat. And they had a whole bunch of sort of older boats there, many of which were designed by the Hershoffs, the two genius brothers who designed lots and lots of boats. And that was really interesting. And I'm going to try to see if I can get an interview with those folks, maybe get someone from the museum to be a guest on the show. So anyway, that's just a little aside for myself. But what do you think, Mike? Time to wrap this one up?
Yeah, that sounds really cool. I like the idea, and kind of continuing on this theme of preservation in museums and history of sailing. I think that'd be a great idea. So yeah, let's do it. Yeah, let's wrap it up for sure. Listeners, thanks for joining us for yet another episode, and we hope you found our conversation interesting and thought-provoking. If you have questions about what we've discussed, please always feel free to get in touch with us. Our email is sailingtheeast, that's all one word, @gmail.com.
And if you enjoyed the podcast, hit that follow button on your favorite podcasting application. If you know of someone that would be a good guest for the show, let us know, and we'll reach out to them. Hope to see you sailing out there. I'm leaving for the boat, I think, in another day or two, and going to spend a week out there. And so looking forward to that. See you all soon.
Great, Bela. Thanks again. And from over here in Münster, Germany, auf Wiedersehen.